It was a quiet Saturday morning at my secluded ranch cabin, and the air was crisp and clean, a perfect morning for a fresh start. The sun was just barely cresting over the distant hills, casting a soft golden hue over the fields surrounding my property. The tranquility of the moment was overwhelming in its simplicity. I sat on the old wooden porch, my favorite place to sip my morning coffee, savoring the peace that only the early hours could offer. The smell of fresh pine and earth filled the air, mixing with the faint scent of morning dew on the grass. For the last few years, this secluded cabin had been my haven. Away from the hustle and noise of city life, it was my escape into quiet solitude. I cherished every moment spent here, far from the prying eyes of society. The cabin was located on the outskirts of a small town, a place where neighbors were few and far between. It was the kind of place where you could walk barefoot for miles, never meeting another soul. A life like that was precisely what I had wanted when I first bought the land. I didn't need the complications of a community or an HOA, especially one as controlling and suffocating as the local homeowners association I had heard so much about. I had no desire to submit to their rules, their regulations, or their ever-watchful eyes. In fact, I had made a point to stay as far from them as possible. The last thing I wanted was to get entangled in their web of bureaucracy. I kept my property, up to my standards, and that was enough. On this particular morning, everything seemed just as it always had, peaceful, quiet, and untouched. My cup of coffee in hand, I leaned back in my chair, watching the sunlight dance over the meadows, when I heard the distant sound of an engine rumbling in the distance. It was faint at first, a low hum carried by the wind, but it steadily grew louder. My gaze shifted toward the sound, and I noticed a white SUV driving up the long gravel driveway that led to my property. It was an unusual sight for someone who rarely saw visitors, let alone strangers. The vehicle, adorned with blue and red flashing lights, seemed out of place in the serene surroundings of my cabin. My brow furrowed as I squinted toward it, trying to make sense of what was happening. Who would be coming here at this time of day, and why would they have flashing lights? As the SUV drew closer, my unease only deepened. The vehicle was clearly designed to resemble a law enforcement vehicle, but it didn't sit right with me. A mixture of curiosity and concern tugged at my gut. Two men stepped out of the SUV. They were tall, with broad shoulders, and both wore dark police-like uniforms. Their badges gleamed in the early morning light, but something about the whole situation felt off. They weren't the kind of officers I was used to seeing, and the tension in the air was palpable as they walked toward my cabin. I stood up slowly from my chair, still holding my cup of coffee in my hands, but now it was more of a prop than a comfort. I could feel my heart rate quicken, the nerves building in my stomach. As they approached the porch, one of them raised his hand in a wave. "Good morning, sir," he greeted me in a calm but authoritative voice. "We're with the HOA enforcement unit. We need to speak with you about a few concerns regarding your property." I froze for a moment, unsure of what to make of the situation. The HOA? What could they possibly want with me? I wasn't a member of any HOA, nor had I ever agreed to follow their rules. Their presence here was both a shock and an intrusion. My eyes darted between the two men, looking for any sign that this was some sort of mistake, but the look on their faces was serious and unyielding. They didn't look like people who were there to offer any explanation or seek a peaceful resolution. They were there with a purpose. "I'm not part of any HOA," I replied cautiously, standing my ground, though my voice betrayed a hint of unease. "I've never signed up, and I have no intention of doing so. So whatever this is, you're going to have to take it somewhere else." The first man who had spoken to me looked at me with an expression that was almost sympathetic, but it didn't make me feel any better. He paused for a moment, glancing at his partner as though exchanging some silent communication. Then, without missing a beat, He continued. "That's precisely why we're here," the other man chimed in, his tone growing more serious, more rigid. "We've received multiple complaints about your property, and we need to address them immediately. Failure to comply could result in penalties or legal action." Penalties? Legal action? My mind raced. I wasn't part of their HOA, and yet here they were, claiming to have received complaints about my property. The very thought that they would send men in police-like uniforms to confront me felt wrong on so many levels. This wasn't just about property complaints. This was about intimidation. These weren't official law enforcement officers, they were imposters, acting under the guise of authority. I felt my blood pressure rise, and a wave of frustration swept over me. I had spent years carefully curating this slice of peace for myself, far away from the intrusive reach of people who thought they could dictate how I should live. This wasn't a small issue. It was a violation of my privacy. They were trying to force me into something I had made very clear I had no interest in being part of. Their presence was an infringement on everything I valued. "I told you already," I said, my voice firmer this time. "I am not a member of your HOA, and I don't intend to become one. If you think I'm going to allow you to trespass on my property and harass me with unfounded complaints, you've got another thing coming." I took a step forward, my stance widening slightly, trying to project the calm confidence I was feeling, beneath the rising frustration. I could sense the tension building between us, and I was ready for them to either explain themselves or leave. The first man seemed to pause, as if weighing his next words carefully. His partner, however, wasn't as restrained. "You need to understand, sir," the second man said, his voice now dripping with authority. "We are here to enforce HOA regulations. These are not just complaints, they are serious matters that could lead to legal ramifications if they aren't resolved. We have every right to be here." I blinked, trying to process the absurdity of the situation. These men had no right to enforce anything on my property. I hadn't agreed to their terms, and there was no law that required me to answer to their made-up authority. Something wasn't adding up. My gut told me this was more than just an overzealous HOA attempting to exert control. It felt like an outright scam. They were using fake authority to intimidate me into compliance. I stood my ground, my mind quickly formulating a response. "You're not real cops. I know you're not. I'll be calling the sheriff, and I suggest you leave before I do." I felt my hand reach for my phone, but I didn't take my eyes off them. I wanted to be sure I wasn't giving them any more opportunities to push me around. The moment I threatened to involve the sheriff, the tone of the interaction shifted. The two men exchanged a brief look, and it was clear they hadn't expected that response. "You can do what you like," the first man said, his voice now colder. "But understand this, you'll be in trouble either way. You can't ignore the HOA's complaints forever." I wasn't about to back down. "I don't care about your HOA," I replied, narrowing my eyes. "I'm calling the sheriff. If you don't leave now, I'll make sure you're arrested for trespassing." Without another word, I turned on my heel and walked inside, grabbing my phone as I went. I quickly dialed the sheriff's department, explaining the situation as calmly as I could, though inside I was boiling. The deputy on the other end of the line assured me they'd send someone out right away to investigate. The moment I hung up, I felt a strange sense of relief. I had done the right thing, but the situation was far from over. I stood my ground, every muscle in my body tense and ready. The sunlight hit my face, but it no longer brought me comfort. I felt the weight of the situation pressing in. "I'm not part of your HOA, and you have no right to come onto my property," I said, my voice steady despite the rapid pounding of my heart. "I suggest you leave." But the two men didn't budge. They didn't seem taken aback by my defiance. Instead, they stood there, exchanging a look that spoke volumes. There was no retreat in their eyes, no sign of understanding or hesitation. These men were not here for a simple misunderstanding. They had a clear goal, and they weren't going to back down easily. The first man, the one who had spoken to me initially, reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a stack of papers. My eyes narrowed. He began flipping through them, each page seeming to weigh down my already heavy sense of unease. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He started listing off alleged violations against my property, ridiculous claims that sounded more like the ramblings of an overzealous bureaucrat than anything based in reality. "Your fence is not up to HOA standards," he said, reading from the page. "The placement of your mailbox violates community guidelines. Your lawn has been reported for being unkempt, and there are several reports about the condition of your driveway." I stood there, stunned. My mind raced as I tried to process the list of absurdities. My fence? It had been standing strong for years, a simple, sturdy structure that I'd built with my own hands. My mailbox? It was no more than a rusted metal box, sure, but it was functional, and I hadn't received any complaints about it before. As for my lawn, it was well maintained, nothing wild or out of control. And my driveway, well, it was gravel, yes, but in perfectly reasonable condition. These were not violations. They were nitpicks, manufactured grievances meant to intimidate. They were irrelevant to my life, to my peace, to the reality of my property. I shook my head slowly, incredulity rising in my chest. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be real. But there they were, standing in front of me, reading off a list of complaints that made no sense. They were taking themselves seriously, as though every word they spoke was law. The gall of it made my blood boil. "I'm not going anywhere until I get some answers," I said firmly, locking eyes with the first man. "Who authorized you to come here?" The second man, who had been silent up until that point, stepped forward. His body language shifted as he took the lead, his posture growing more aggressive, his eyes narrowing with a sense of entitlement. There was no confusion in his demeanor now. He was used to exerting control, and I was nothing more than a person standing in his way. "We've been authorized by the HOA to enforce these rules," he said, his voice cold and dismissive. "If you don't comply, we will have no choice but to take further action." Take further action? My mind reeled. What kind of action were they threatening? These men weren't even legitimate officers. They weren't in law enforcement. They didn't have the power to do anything other than harass me. And yet here they were, throwing around vague threats like they were the final word on everything. I could feel my frustration building, but I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. "Further action," I echoed, my voice rising, now tinged with disbelief and anger. "You're not real cops. You have no authority here. You're nothing but bullies in costume pretending to be something you're not." The words came out harsher than I expected, but they felt right, and I didn't regret them. I pointed at their badges, which now seemed comically out of place on their uniforms. They didn't look like police officers. The stitching was off, the colors too bright, the design too flimsy. These men weren't fooling anyone who knew the first thing about law enforcement. "You're not real cops," I repeated, my voice cutting through the air with a sharpness that I hoped would make them think twice. "Get off my property, or I'll call the authorities." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with challenge. My hand instinctively reached for my phone in my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cool screen. I didn't take my eyes off the two men as I pulled it out and unlocked it. I was done with this charade. It was time to call for help, to get someone on the line who would take me seriously. Before I could dial the number for the sheriff's department, one of the men took a step forward, his posture tightening. There was a brief flash of something in his eyes, something almost like rage, but it quickly morphed back into cold calculation. "You think calling the sheriff is going to stop us?" the second man sneered. "You're wasting your time. We've been authorized by the HOA, and we will continue with our work whether you like it or not. If you're unwilling to cooperate, we'll take this further. There's nothing you can do to stop us." I had heard enough. I wasn't going to let these men push me around anymore. The situation had escalated far beyond a simple misunderstanding. This was a deliberate attempt to assert authority over me, to force me into submission by any means necessary. The fake cops were trying to make me feel powerless, to make me believe that I had no choice but to comply with their arbitrary demands. But I wasn't going to give in to their threats. I wasn't going to let them dictate my life. I dialed the sheriff's department, my fingers shaking only slightly as I pressed the numbers. The phone rang, and I could hear the hum of the connection on the other end. When a deputy finally picked up, I wasted no time explaining the situation. "Hello, I need help. I'm at my ranch cabin, and 2 men claiming to be from the HOA are here on my property. They're dressed in police-like uniforms, but they don't have proper badges or any credentials. They're making threats and trying to intimidate me into complying with their rules even though I'm not a member of their HOA. I'm not sure what they're planning, but I need someone to come out here and handle this. They're trespassing." There was a brief silence on the other end before the deputy responded, his voice calm and reassuring. "Understood, sir. We'll send someone out right away to investigate. Stay where you are and don't engage with them further. We'll handle it." I hung up the phone, my heart still racing. The sheriff's deputy had assured me help was on the way, but that didn't mean these men would just leave peacefully. They had come here with a mission, and I wasn't going to let them get away with it. The silence between the men and me now felt even more loaded than before. I kept my eyes fixed on them, every nerve in my body alert. They hadn't left, and I wasn't about to let them intimidate me into submission. The power dynamic had shifted. I wasn't the one who was powerless here. It was them. They were the ones who had stepped out of line, and I was going to make sure they paid for it. The first man looked at me, his jaw clenched. "You don't have to make this more difficult," he said, his voice quieter now, as though trying to regain some semblance of control. "You can still comply and avoid the consequences. The HOA doesn't want to escalate this any further." "Escalate this?" I retorted. "You've already escalated it by pretending to be something you're not. You've already crossed the line." I could see the anger flash across his face, and for a moment, it looked like he might take a step toward me, perhaps to intimidate me physically. But before he could act, a distant sound interrupted the tension, the rumble of an engine approaching. The sheriff was on his way. The weight of the day's events hung heavy over me as the sheriff's deputy finally arrived at my ranch cabin. By then, the 2 men who had posed as law enforcement officers had already retreated to their vehicle, clearly rattled by the involvement of actual authorities. The sheriff, a seasoned officer with years of experience, surveyed the situation with a calm, measured demeanor. He looked over at me, his face sympathetic but firm. "Can you explain to me what happened?" he asked, his voice steady as if he had seen this kind of thing before. I recounted everything from the moment the 2 men had arrived at my property, their aggressive behavior and their false claims about their authority. As I spoke, I could feel the anger surging back in me, but I focused on getting the facts straight. I wasn't about to let their intimidation tactics cloud my judgment. By the time I finished my story, the sheriff's eyes had narrowed in disbelief. "That's not right," he said, shaking his head slowly. "Those men had no legal right to be here, and they're certainly not affiliated with any law enforcement agency. They were impersonating officers, and that's a crime. You've done the right thing by calling us." His words were both a relief and a trigger for something deeper inside me, a fire that had been slowly smoldering ever since the 2 men had first shown up on my property. It wasn't just the trespassing or the harassment that upset me. It was the sheer audacity of the HOA, assuming they could push me around, that got under my skin. They thought they could bully me into submission with their fake officers and their empty threats. But they were wrong. I wasn't going to let this slide. The sheriff explained that while the HOA might have the power to enforce certain regulations within their jurisdiction, they did not have the authority to hire impersonators or enforce laws under the guise of law enforcement. What those men had done was illegal, plain and simple. The sheriff assured me that an investigation would be launched into the HOA's actions, and he would personally make sure that the imposters faced the consequences for their illegal behavior. Get in touch with a lawyer, the sheriff advised me, because this isn't just about trespassing. What they did here today was a violation of your rights. You've got grounds for a lawsuit. The words hit me like a bolt of lightning. I had never been one to think in terms of lawsuits, and the idea of dragging the HOA into a lengthy legal battle seemed daunting. But something about the sheriff's words sparked a realization in me. I couldn't let this go. The HOA had crossed a line. They had tried to intimidate me, to force me into compliance with their ridiculous rules and regulations, and they had done so with the most egregious of tactics. It wasn't just about the harassment I had experienced. It was about sending a message that I wasn't going to be bullied, that I wasn't going to let them get away with this kind of behavior. Later that afternoon, after the sheriff had left, and the imposters were long gone, I sat down at my kitchen table, the weight of the situation settling in. The cabin, which had always been a place of peace for me, now felt like a battleground. But I wasn't going to back down. I reached for my phone and began searching for a lawyer. I knew that the next steps would be crucial, and I wanted to make sure I had someone who could help me navigate the legal system. After a few calls, I found a lawyer who specialized in property rights and civil litigation. I explained the situation in as much detail as I could, recounting the entire incident, the imposters, and the threats they had made. The lawyer, a woman named Rachel, was calm but clearly concerned when I finished. "This is a serious matter," she said, her voice low but steady. "What the HOA did is not only unlawful, but it's also a clear violation of your rights. They cannot just send people to your property pretending to be officers. They've crossed the line in a way that will have legal consequences." Rachel explained that, in order to build a solid case, we would need to gather as much evidence as possible. That meant tracking down any information about the individuals who had impersonated the officers, including their names, who had hired them, and any documentation or records that the HOA had on the matter. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick, but I was determined to see it through. We agreed to meet in person the following week, where she would begin the process of drafting a lawsuit. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, emails, and research. I spent hours going through every document I could find related to the HOA, digging into their rules and regulations, trying to find something, anything that would give me leverage. I wasn't about to let them get away with this. I knew I had to act quickly before they could cover their tracks or mount a defense. The longer I waited, the more they would have time to manipulate the situation in their favor. The investigation into the HOA's actions moved slowly at first. I was constantly in touch with Rachel, updating her on what I had discovered and asking for guidance on the next steps. We had a few leads, but nothing concrete. The HOA, as it turned out, had a lot of money and a lot of resources at its disposal, which made things complicated. But I wasn't deterred. Every phone call, every piece of new information only fueled my determination. The more I learned about the HOA's practices, the more I realized that I was up against a powerful and, in many ways, corrupt organization. Weeks passed, and the investigation began to gain momentum. We found a witness, a local resident who had seen the two imposters talking to a member of the HOA the day before the incident. This was a breakthrough. With this new information, we were able to trace the connection between the imposters and the HOA, building a clear link between them. I was no longer just fighting an abstract entity. I was fighting against a group of people who had intentionally set out to violate my rights. The case was finally ready to go to court. It felt surreal. I had spent months preparing, gathering evidence, and fighting against the overwhelming sense of helplessness that had threatened to take over in the early days of this ordeal. But now, I was ready. I wasn't just going to stand there and let the HOA trample over me. I wasn't going to let them get away with their illegal actions. The time for negotiation was over. It was time for justice. The courtroom was intimidating, far more so than I had imagined. I had never been involved in a legal battle like this before, and the experience was overwhelming. There was a sense of finality as I sat in the witness stand, recounting everything that had happened. Rachel, my lawyer, had prepared me well. She guided me through every step of the process, making sure I stayed focused and clear in my testimony. The opposing side, lawyers hired by the HOA, tried their best to poke holes in my story, to discredit my claims, but they couldn't. The evidence was too strong. Over the course of several weeks, the case dragged on. There were delays, objections, and countless procedural motions, but I wasn't about to back down. I couldn't. The stakes were too high. This wasn't just about me. It was about sending a message that people couldn't be treated like this, that the HOA couldn't get away with using intimidation, fake officers, and legal threats to force people into submission. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. I sat in the courtroom, my heart racing, as the judge read out the decision. The words seemed to echo in my ears as I listened intently. The judge ruled in my favor. The HOA was found liable for their actions, and they were ordered to pay significant damages for harassment, emotional distress, and the illegal actions of their hired impersonators. The victory felt both overwhelming and liberating. After months of fighting, I had won. But the victory was more than just financial. It was a statement. It was a reminder that people like the HOA, who believed they could intimidate others into submission, could be held accountable. They couldn't just push people around with impunity. The law was on my side, and it always had been. As I walked out of the courtroom, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The battle was over, and I had come out on top. The HOA had learned a valuable lesson, and so had I. I had learned that sometimes standing up for your rights isn't easy, but it's always worth it. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. My heart pounded in my chest, a constant reminder of the intense journey I had been through to get to this moment. The last few weeks had been a blur of legal arguments, courtroom debates, and emotional strain. Every time I thought the end was in sight, there was another delay, another objection, another hurdle to overcome. But now, as I sat there waiting for the final decision, it felt like everything had led to this one moment. The opposing attorneys from the HOA sat across from me, their faces stoic, their expressions guarded. I could sense that they were just as nervous as I was, though they wouldn't dare show it. They had fought hard to defend their clients, but the evidence against them was undeniable. The fake officers, the harassment, the unlawful tactics. They couldn't hide behind their usual methods of intimidation any longer. The truth had come to light, and it was clear that they had crossed a line that would not be tolerated. I glanced at my lawyer, Rachel, sitting beside me. She was calm, collected as always, her focus unwavering. Over the past several months, Rachel had become more than just my lawyer. She had become my ally, my guide through the legal maze that had become my life. Without her, I wouldn't have known where to start, let alone how to navigate the complex world of property law and civil litigation. She had believed in the case from the beginning, never doubting that we could win, even when the situation seemed impossible. Her confidence had been a steady anchor, grounding me when I felt like giving up. The judge, an older man with a no-nonsense demeanor, finally looked up from the papers in front of him. He adjusted his glasses and glanced around the room before addressing the court. His voice was steady and authoritative, and I felt the weight of his words as they filled the room. After carefully reviewing the evidence presented and hearing the arguments of both parties, the judge began, his eyes scanning the room. It is clear that the actions of the defendants, specifically their use of impersonators and their unlawful attempts to enforce HOA regulations, constitute a violation of the plaintiff's rights. The defendant's actions were not only illegal, but also an infringement on the plaintiff's right to enjoy his property free from harassment. I held my breath, the words slowly sinking in. It was happening. The moment I had worked so hard for, the moment I had fought through every obstacle for, was finally here. Therefore, the judge continued, the court finds in favor of the plaintiff. The Homeowners Association is hereby ordered to pay damages for the unlawful actions of their agents, including emotional distress, harassment, and the illegal impersonation of law enforcement officers. Furthermore, the HOA is prohibited from engaging in any further harassment of the plaintiff or any other non-member of the association. A wave of relief flooded through me. I couldn't believe it. The victory was mine. Not just mine, but also a victory for anyone who had ever been harassed or intimidated by an HOA. It was a victory for anyone who had been pushed around by those in power who thought they could operate with impunity. The case wasn't just about me. It was about sending a message to organizations like the HOA that they couldn't just trample on people's rights without facing consequences. Rachel gave me a small, knowing smile, a silent acknowledgement of the battle we had just won. I could feel her pride in me, in the victory we had achieved together. But it wasn't just about legal triumph, it was about the principle. We had stood up for what was right, and we had been heard. The judge's ruling was not just a personal victory, but one that would resonate for years to come. As the legal papers were signed and the court session officially adjourned, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. The burden that had weighed on me for so long seemed to lift, replaced by an overwhelming sense of satisfaction. The battle was over, and I had emerged victorious. But the true depth of the victory didn't sink in until I stepped out of the courthouse. The sunlight was brighter outside, the air fresher. It felt as though the whole world had opened up to me again. The cabin that had been a sanctuary during the legal battle, a place of refuge amidst the chaos, was now something even more sacred. It wasn't just a retreat. It was a symbol of resilience. I drove back to the ranch that afternoon, the familiar landscape stretching out before me, and I couldn't help but think about everything I had been through. It seemed surreal to think that just a few months ago, I had been an unwitting target of an overbearing HOA, trying to enjoy a quiet life away from the complications of modern society. But now, my fight had become something bigger. I had shown that even the most powerful institutions weren't invincible, that no matter how much money or influence they had, they couldn't trample on people's rights without facing consequences. As I drove, I thought about the other people I had met over the course of this ordeal, the people who had reached out to me, offering their support, telling me their own stories of being bullied by HOAs or other organizations like it. There were countless individuals out there who had been subjected to the same kind of treatment I had faced, people who had been too afraid to speak out or take action. I realized then that my victory wasn't just mine. It belonged to all of them, too. The people who had been silenced, who had been ignored, who had been made to feel powerless. Now, they had a voice. They had a reason to believe that standing up for themselves could lead to change. By the time I reached my ranch cabin, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the land. The quiet beauty of the scene before me was overwhelming, and I stood for a long moment, taking it all in. The victory I had just won was not just legal. It was deeply personal. It was a triumph of perseverance, a testament to the power of standing up for what was right, no matter the odds. The following weeks were filled with phone calls and paperwork as the HOA complied with the court's ruling. They paid the damages, and they were forced to cease all harassment of non-members. I received a formal apology from the HOA, but it felt hollow, unearned. It wasn't their words that mattered now. It was the legal action that had made them pay for their actions. They had learned their lesson. They had learned that they couldn't just impose their will on anyone they chose, that their power had limits, and those limits had been tested. But the best part of it all was the peace that followed. the peace that I had fought so hard to reclaim. My ranch cabin, once again, became the sanctuary I had always envisioned it to be. The sense of freedom, the tranquility, the escape from the noise of the world, it was all back. Only now it felt even more precious. I knew that no matter what challenges life threw my way, I had the strength to face them. I had taken on an entire organization and come out victorious. If I could do that, I could handle anything. As the weeks turned into months, I kept in touch with Rachel, who was still fighting other similar cases. She continued to represent clients who had been pushed around by HOAs, and I couldn't help but feel grateful for the role I had played in setting a precedent that would protect others from the same kind of treatment. I knew that this victory, this fight for justice, would be a story I would tell for the rest of my life. It was a reminder that standing up for what is right, no matter how daunting the fight may seem, can lead to real change. In the end, the victory wasn't just about me. It was about everyone who had ever been pushed around, intimidated, or made to feel small. It was about the power of the individual to rise above, to challenge those who abuse their power, and to reclaim what is rightfully theirs. It was a win for the little guy, for the underdog, for anyone who had ever felt powerless. As I sat on the porch of my cabin that evening, looking out over the land I had fought so hard to protect, I couldn't help but smile. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky was painted in shades of pink and purple. It was a perfect end to a perfect day. I had won. Join the fight for your rights and learn more by subscribing to the HOA Stories today.